Hello there. Welcome to another video lesson by Mrs. Messick. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about concept 2. So we're moving on. We spent our first section talking about ocean circulations and air movement. We're going to kind of put that together and go on to section 2. And section 2 begins with talking about predicting the weather. So a meteorologist is a person who actually has a career predicting the weather. And we're just going to be talking about kind of like how does a meteorologist do that? What do you need to know in order to try to predict what the weather is going to be like? So we're going to take what we know about the ocean circulations and what we know about the air patterns, and we're going to kind of put those together. And so the interactions between the water and the wind and those things put together is a lot of what meteorologists use to figure out what is going to happen with the weather. So the mix of water and air form what is known as an air mass. And so picture, a big body of air that has similar characteristics. So within that body of air, it has the same temperature, it has the same pressure, whether it's high or low pressure, the amount of pressure, and it also has the same humidity. And the word humidity is not something that we've talked a lot about, but it means how much moisture is it holding in that air. Is it really, really wet air? Like what we would describe as like muggy, or is it super dry air? Okay, so an air mass is a body of air with the same temperature, pressure, and humidity. So how does this group of air, get these characteristics? Like what determines, what the temperature is going to be of that air? And it all depends on what section of Earth it is traveling over. So if a body of air is traveling over a certain part of Earth, it will pick up certain things from that area. Let me try to explain what I mean. So if, here's the equator area. Actually, this map is a little off because we're not at the equator. So this map is kind of spun downward. North Pole's right here. So down near the equator, any air that's traveling over the equator is going to collect that warmth. And so air traveling over that area is going to be warm air. Whereas if you have air that is traveling over the north or south poles, it is going to be an air mass that is cold in temperature. So over the equator is going to be warm air, and then closer to the north and south poles is going to be cold air. And so then one of the other characteristics that we can talk about is the humidity of the air mass. So if you have an air mass that's traveling across the ocean, that air mass is going to pick up, it's going to kind of suck up a lot of the water, the moisture from that big body of water, and it's going to carry it with it. And so it's going to be very humid. So if it's traveling over water, it's going to pick up moisture, and it's going to be very wet air mass. If an air mass is traveling over a continent, though, which is land, it is going to be drier because there's not, it's not traveling over water, so it's not picking up that water as it goes. So you can combine characteristics for an air mass. So if you have an air mass that's traveling over a continent near the North Pole, the characteristics for that air mass would be dry because it's over land, and it would be cold because it's near the poles. But if you have an air mass that's around the equator and it's traveling through an ocean, then it's going to be warm because it's near the equator, and it's also going to be very wet because it's traveling over the ocean and picking up that water. Okay, so an air mass gets its characteristic from the part of Earth that it's traveling over. There are some science words to describe these particular characteristics of the air masses. So the first one, if air is moving over land, it tends to be very dry. So we call it a continental air mass. And so you need to remember that dry goes with land and land goes with the word continental. So if we're trying to describe a dry air mass, we're going to use the word continental. Okay. Our next word, if air is moving over water, then it is going to be very wet. The word we use to describe that is maritime, which is a word that describes bodies of water. So maritime goes with wet, and continental goes with dry. Okay? The other two are a little easier. If it is a warm body of air, we call it tropical, because it's probably in the tropical area of the earth. And if it is a cold body of air, we call it polar, because it is probably coming from the North or South Pole. So our four words are continental, which means dry, maritime, which means wet, polar, which means cold, and tropical, which means warm. Okay, so there's different weather happening in different places all over the world. So, the West Coast might be having some really rainy, wet, cold weather, and at the same time, the East Coast down here might be having some really wet but warm weather. And the reason that you can have different weather happening in different places is because of the air mass that you find there. So these characteristics of the air mass is what causes the weather in that certain location. So you can combine these words to describe an air mass. So I want to give you an example here, okay? So if I had an air mass that was over water, traveling here, and near the equator, okay? This air mass is going to be described as maritime because it's traveling over water, and it's going to be described as tropical because it's in a warm part of the earth. So you would say it's maritime tropical. Okay. Another example is some air that is traveling through water, but up closer to the North Pole. It is also going to be maritime because it's coming over the water, but it's going to be polar because it's going to be a very cold air mass. So this air mass would be described as maritime polar. Okay. Another combination would be traveling over land. So let's say there's an air mass traveling up through Mexico, and it's traveling over land, which means it's going to be a very dry air mass. We call that continental, but it's also closer to the equator in a very warm part of the earth, so we call it continental tropical. Okay, we put those words together. And then our last example is if you have an air mass traveling over land, okay, coming down through from the North Pole down through upper Canada, it's going to be dry because it's coming over land. So we use the word continental. And it's also going to be very cold because it started out by the North Pole and it's traveling through a cold part of the earth. So we would say it is continental polar. Okay? And those are our different combinations that we can make out of our new words. Okay, so you have, back on your sheet, you have a table that I want you guys to fill in where you can combine the different characteristics and then tell me what would be the term that we would use in science to describe that air mass. I filled in one of them for you to kind of show you how I want you to do it, and then I'd like you to fill in the others. I'm also going to put a link to a video by a meteorologist in the United Kingdom who describes air masses. So it's just an additional video if you want to watch it and hear somebody else describe it and kind of show some maps and stuff to help it make sense. And then lastly, there's a lot of new words lately for our unit. So I'm going to put up a link to a Quizlet that has the vocabulary words so far for our unit, and I would like you to practice the vocabulary words. Okay? All right, it was great teaching you guys today. I hope that you guys are doing well. I miss teaching you in person for sure. And we will continue learning about all the things you need to know to be able to predict the weather. And I'll see you soon.